In this video, we'll be taking a look at the bones of the elbow, including the distal end of the humerus, as well as the proximal ends of the radius and ulna. Moving to a closer view of the distal humerus, we note that the inferior aspect of the humeral shaft widens both medially and laterally into what are known as supracondylar ridges. By following the medial supracondylar ridge distally, we reach a high point on the inside of the elbow known as the medial epicondyle. Following the lateral supracondylar ridge takes us to a corresponding high point on the lateral side of the elbow known as the lateral epicondyle. These prominent areas of the bone serve as important sites for muscle and ligament attachment. The most distal aspect of the humerus, shown here, is known as the condyle. It may be subdivided into medial and lateral portions with two distinct articular surfaces. This one, medially, has a complex shape resembling a pulley or spool and is known as the trochlea. It articulates with the proximal ulna. This one, located laterally, is quite rounded, is known as the capitulum, and articulates with the head of the radius. Above each of these articular surfaces lies a shallow depression. Here, the shallow depression above the capitulum is known as the radial fossa. Here, the shallow depression above the trochlea is known as the coronoid fossa. Switching to a posterior view, we see a third depression here known as the Olecranon fossa. Returning to the intact skeletal model, we can see the relationship between the trochlea here, which again articulates with the proximal ulna, and the capitulum here, articulating with the proximal radius. When the elbow is moved into flexion, the head of the radius fits into the radial fossa, while this projection of bone known as the coronoid process of the ulna fits into the coronoid fossa. A posterior view of the flexed elbow reveals the Olecranon fossa, while moving this joint into extension demonstrates how the Olecranon process, here, part of the ulna, fits into the Olecranon fossa when the elbow is extended. Moving on to the forearm, between elbow and wrist, we'll next take a look at the ulna and the radius. The ulna is the longer of the two bones and has a well-developed proximal end with a larger articular surface. The radius is the more lateral bone and has a well-developed distal end, which we'll discuss in a later video on the wrist. When flexion and extension occur at the elbow, both bones are in motion. However, the radius has the ability to also rotate through pronation and supination, which occur at the proximal and distal radio-ulnar joints. By removing the humerus and the radius, we'll take a closer look at the proximal ulna. The proximal end of the ulna is marked by two prominent projections of bone, the coronoid process anteriorly and the Olecranon process posteriorly. These two markings border the trochlear notch, which is the articular surface that meets the trochlea of the humerus. Just distal to this, on the lateral side, is an indentation known as the radial notch that houses the head of the radius and forms part of the proximal radio-ulnar joint. This ridge of bone extending below it is known as the supinator crest. Finally, this roughened area just distal to the coronoid process is known as the ulnar tuberosity. Moving on to the proximal radius, we note the rounded radial head with its concave articular surface, the tapered area just below it, which is known as the neck of the radius, and this large bony protuberance known as the radial tuberosity. It may also be referred to as the bicipital tuberosity because it serves as the site of insertion for the biceps brachii muscle. We will return one last time to our intact skeletal model to observe the motions of pronation and supination. Note that the ulna remains relatively stationary, while the radial tuberosity is turned downward in pronation and upwards, as is the palm of the hand, in supination. We will cover additional structures on the distal end of the radius and ulna in a subsequent video.